In this lecture, we're moving up in scale again to talk about landscape ecology. So this is the material in chapter 21 of your textbooks. So in terms of lecture themes, first we're going to introduce landscape ecology, so what constitutes a landscape and what is the field of landscape ecology. Then we'll talk about the origins of landscapes, so what are the processes that shape landscapes. So the physical processes like volcanic activity or the movement of glaciers, as well as other factors that shape landscapes like the activities of organisms. Then we'll talk about landscape structure, so how landscape structure is described and measured. And then landscape processes, so how does landscape structure affect organisms essentially. So an example of this might be how does landscape fragmentation affect the movement of animals? So just to start, we'll introduce some terms. So a landscape is defined as a heterogeneous area composed of distinct patches. So a landscape element is essentially one of those patches within the landscape. So landscape ecology, the field of landscape ecology, is the study of the relationship between spatial pattern and ecological processes over a range of scales. And we'll discuss some of those scales over the course of this lecture. So landscape ecology is defined by three major facets. The first is it's described very nicely as focusing on understanding the extent, origin and ecological consequences of spatial heterogeneity across multiple scales. So it's acknowledging the heterogeneity in landscapes and studying what that heterogeneity does to organisms and how it affects their processes. The second facet is that this is a really highly interdisciplinary subject, and so it involves scientists that do things on a really small scale, like counting seeds in a transect, to scientists who use satellites to create images of whole continents, for example. But it also involves a lot of collaboration between scientists and land managers. So most construction companies, for example, will hire ecologists who help them mitigate the environmental impacts of any building projects that they're doing. And this is a really practical example of what landscape ecology can be. The third facet that kind of defines landscape ecology is that although it's a relatively young scientific discipline, humans throughout time have had to be landscape ecologists. So hunter-gatherers needed to know where to find food and where game animals hid. And the first agriculturalists needed to know which part of the landscape was best suited for growing crops, and which part of the landscape might be good for use as pasture for animals. And so this is a discipline that's involved humans from the very beginning, and it's born out of a need for humans to maximize the utility of the landscape. So for that reason, it's often associated with conservation biology. And that's not to say that all studies involving landscape ecology have to be conservation focused, but there is very often a link there. So we know that a landscape can broadly be defined as a heterogeneous area comprised of distinct patches. So we're going to talk for a little while about the processes that drive the formation of that landscape. So over geological time, processes like volcanic activity, erosion and sedimentation occur to create landscape elements. And over ecological time, factors like climate, fire and the activity of organisms influence landscape structure. Probably the biggest factor that's driven landscape structure in North America is glaciation. So these two maps show the extent of glacial activity in the late 20th century on the left and 18,000 years ago on the right, when glaciers covered almost the whole of Canada. So the slow retreat of these glaciers have left behind a mosaic of different conditions and sediments that in turn have led to a mosaic of vegetation across northern North America. The US and Canada have been repeatedly covered by glaciers in the past. A glacial age includes a period of glaciation, which is the cold period, which lasts usually about 60 to 90,000 years. And then those glaciations are interrupted by interglacials, which is where we are now. These are warmer periods that last about 10 to 40,000 years. As glaciers move, they obviously transform the landscape in fairly dramatic ways. And as they move and retreat, one thing they do is they move sediment in such a way that they create areas of increased substrate and areas of decreased substrate. So increased substrate areas are things like talus or rock piles. There's till, so these are unsorted piles of clay and rock and boulders. Then there are moraines, so this is piles of till. So, for example, a terminal moraine is essentially a kind of hill of rocks that's kind of pushed along at the front of the glacier. And then there are drumlins, so these are reshaped moraines. So this is where glaciers melt back and then reform, riding over an initial moraine. They form something called a drumlin. Then there are areas of decreased substrate, so kettles. These are depressions in the rock that are caused when large bodies of ice slowly melt and fill with water to create kettle lakes. And the reason for this kind of short geography lesson is that all of these different landforms created by glaciers provide completely different substrates and support completely different plant communities. And so often the mosaic of vegetation that we see on the landscape is a direct result of glaciation that may have happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. So this figure just shows some examples of the dramatic landscapes produced by glaciation. So this, you see a huge U-shaped valley, which is kind of obviously distinct from the V-shaped valleys that are produced by streams. You can also see some eskers in the image below that. So this is where streams that are fed by glaciers deposit large amounts of rock material at their edges as they flow away from the glacier. This is an aerial image of some kettle lakes. So you see this kind of potted landscape where large bodies of ice have melted slowly over time, leaving a recess that develops into a kettle lake. The landscape elements that are created by and left behind by retreating glaciers don't contain any plant material. There's no soil or seed bank. So it'd be reasonable to ask, where do the plant communities that colonize these landscape elements initially come from? And the answer is they come from either glacial refugia, so these are areas that were never glaciated. So a good example of this in Canada would be in Nunatak. These are mountain peaks that were surrounded by but not covered by these glaciers. And the other place that these plants could come from is populations south of the terminal extent of the glaciers. So for example, the Cypress Hills of Alberta or Saskatchewan. We focused so far on the physical processes that create landscape elements and affect landscape structure, but landscape structure is also affected in a big way by the activity of organisms, and that's what we're going to talk about for a couple of slides now. So in many areas of the world, what's been happening over recent centuries has been the conversion of forest landscapes to more agricultural landscapes or agricultural land uses. But in some regions, particularly in eastern North America and Europe, abandoned farms are being reverted to forests. So we're seeing an increase in the forested area of the landscape compared to agricultural land uses. And this obviously has ramifications for organisms and species that are adapted to farm fields. This figure shows essentially how the landscape is changing or has been changing in the Veluwe region of central Holland over the last 150 years or so. So as you can see, in the last maybe 70 or 80 years, we're starting to see some urban development in the region. The amount of the region that's used for agriculture has stayed fairly stable over the last 150 years or so. But what's changed in a big way is the conversion from heathland into mature forest. This shift in landscape structure in this case is driven largely by economic factors. So this heathland that you can see in the foreground now is traditionally used to raise sheep, but in recent decades or over as much as a century, the economy for raising sheep has collapsed. And this is because of the advent of synthetic fertilizers where sheep manure would have previously been used. And the availability of inexpensive imported wool has led in this region of the Netherlands to the collapse of this industry. And so therefore this heathland is being abandoned and slowly being taken over by mature forests. There are obviously many more dramatic examples of where humans have modified the landscape. This is an aerial view of the Everglades, a landscape more and more of which looks like this. This is the town of Weston in South Florida. But as well as humans, there are many other animals that can significantly modify the landscape and affect landscape structure. And one example is these guys, the beavers. Beavers were once incredibly abundant across much of the US, but in the early 20th century, they were more or less extinct from many areas, mainly from overhunting for their hides. And Minnesota was one of those areas, but the beavers were reintroduced and re-established. And this figure shows some data from Robert Nyman, who looked at the effects of that reintroduction on landscape structure in this area of Minnesota. So he looked at an area that 100 years ago was almost entirely forest and is now made up of a patchwork of different ecosystems, and in particular beaver ponds. So as well as creating a more heterogeneous landscape with beaver ponds and wet prairies, the introduction of beavers, Nyman found, increased nutrient retention on the landscape. So nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium were increased by 72, 43 and 20% respectively over the course of this study. So this increased nutrient storage in the landscape seems to be because beaver ponds trap nutrients that were previously being eroded and leached from the landscape. So as we talk about the effects of organisms on landscape structure, it's time to define a few key terms relating to landscape structure. So we know that a landscape is a homogeneous area comprised of different patches. And the study of landscape structure, or the description of landscape structure, is to do with describing those patches. So it talks about the size, shape, composition and number and position of those patches within the landscape. So a patch on the landscape is a relatively homogeneous area that differs from its surroundings. And those patches in the landscape form a mosaic that we call landscape structure. The background of that mosaic is called the matrix. So the matrix is the element within the landscape that is most spatially continuous. So this is an aerial view of San Francisco. So you can see here that there are patches of forest and patches of parkland, but the main, most continuous part of the landscape is the urban development. So this is an urban matrix. But similarly, you might have landscapes that are predominantly forest landscapes with patches of urban development. So the matrix is the most spatially continuous part of the landscape. So as I say, in this case, it's an urban matrix. So there are many different ways that we can measure or quantify landscape structure, and some of those are shown really nicely by Bowen and Burgess from their 1968 study. And they looked at the distribution of forest patches in 6 different regions of Ohio. So these 6 images here show the 6 different regions. The dark green patches are forest patches, and the light green areas are patches of other habitat types. So one way you might measure or quantify landscape structure here is just looking at total forest cover. So you can see even at a glance some fairly obvious differences in total forest cover. But by measuring forest cover, Bowen and Burgess actually showed, for example, that the Somerset plot in this case has actually over double the forest cover that the Monroe plot has, and that wouldn't be obvious at a glance. And so these things can be quite deceptive based on the distribution, shape, and size of the patches themselves. Other ways you might quantify landscape structure in this case is to look at the number of different forest patches within each area, within each region, the median size of forest patches within each region. And another thing that Bowen and Burgess looked at was average patch shape. So the way they quantified patch shape was to look at the ratio of the patch perimeter to the perimeter of a circle with the same area of the patch. So what they're looking at is to what extent does the shape of each patch deviate from a perfect circle. So if the shapes were perfect circles, then S would be 1, but as S increases, that means that the patch is kind of more elongated and has more kind of intricate edges and deviates further from the shape of a circle. So this is important ecologically because patches that deviate from a circular shape have more edge, and forest edges have different species, they have different conditions in them, and also a patch with more edge is going to be more severely affected by the surrounding landscape. So this can be a really, really important element of landscape structure. So this graph on the right shows the results of Bowen and Burgess of the average patch shape in these 6 different regions. So the Concord region had the roundest patches, it had the lowest value for S, despite having the lowest number of patches and the lowest total forest cover. The least round patches were found in the Washington region, which is also the region with the highest total forest cover. And again, this kind of patch shape is very important because this increased edge that you get in odd-shaped patches can affect both the physical environment in the interior of the patches if they're close to edges, and also species on the interior of these patches might be more likely to be exposed to parasites and pathogens that occur outside the patches. So there are various different reasons why patch shape can be incredibly important, sometimes more so than patch size. So understanding and measuring or quantifying landscape structure is important because landscape structure affects ecologically important processes. So these landscape processes, like the movement of organisms, distribution of species, local population densities or extinction risk, as well as things like nutrient cycling and the chemistry of lakes and rivers, all of these things are affected by landscape structure. And so we'll talk about some examples of how landscape structure affects some of these landscape processes. One of the central ideas for understanding how landscape structure affects landscape processes is the theory of island biogeography. This is E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur's theory. So in their theory, there's a mainland here with several islands radiating from that mainland. So these might be littoral islands, or they might be patches of habitat surrounded by a matrix of different habitats. Essentially, the number of species in each patch and the probability of extinction of species in that patch is dependent on the size of the patch and its isolation or its distance from the mainland. So large patches that are close to the mainland are going to receive lots of immigration from the mainland. We're very unlikely to see regional extinction because species are going to be replenished by immigration from the mainland. As patch sizes get smaller, they hold less species, they hold those species in lower numbers, and so the chances of extinction increase. And that chance of extinction is increased more and more with isolation of that patch. So if you can see the small island on the right hand side in the lower right corner of this slide is going to have very few species and a very high chance of extinction of those species. So as MacArthur and Wilson suggested, landscape structure can influence movement of organisms between potentially suitable habitats. So habitat fragmentation, for example, is the division of previously intact habitat into several isolated patches. And the size of the patches created and how isolated those patches are will affect the ability of those patches to support species and the movement of species. So there have been a number of really good studies looking into the effects of habitat patch size on the movement of organisms. So Diffendorfer, Gaines and Holt in 1995 looked at how habitat patch size affected the movement of 3 small rodent species: cotton rats, prairie voles and deer mice. So what they did was to manipulate areas of prairie habitat into different patch sizes. So the areas they were working with were each about 12 hectares in size, so maybe 100 meters by 50 meters. Some of those areas they left completely intact, so one large patch of prairie habitat. Others they mowed into 15 very small patches of prairie habitat, and others they mowed into 6 medium-sized patches of prairie habitat. Then within those different regions, they released and then trapped these 3 different species of rodent. So they would conduct live trappings where they would then mark individual rodents that they could then recapture them. Over time, they conducted several thousand captures, and they could use their captures of similar individuals or the same individuals to map the movement of individual rodents within these different regions of habitat. What they predicted was that when habitat patches were small, they would see increased movement or kind of immigration and emigration between patches by these rodents. And that's because the rodents would need to travel further to find food and to find mates. And that is indeed what they found. So the average distance moved by individual rodents was lowest in the large patches and highest with low patch size. And that's, we predict, because rodents are having to travel further, move between patches to find food and to find mates. What they also found though, and this is shown by the graph on the right, was that the proportion of individual rodents moving in the 3 different species, so the proportion of them that moved any distance at all, was highest in the large patch sizes. And this is, we predict, because although in small patch sizes rodents might need to move between patches to find resources, to find food and mates, in larger patches it's easier for the rodents to move through those habitats. They don't have to go through difficult terrain where they might be more at risk of predation, or they might be low resource availability for them. So their ability to move within patches is greater, and so a higher proportion of individuals were moving some distance within larger patches. Another really good example of an experiment that's looked at the effects of landscape structure on organisms comes from Lenore Farig from 1997, and she was famous for using, or is famous for using, computer simulations to ask questions about ecology. So in this case, she used these simulations to try to tease apart 2 different effects of habitat fragmentation. So when a habitat is fragmented, 2 different things are happening. First of all, some of that habitat is being destroyed, so we're getting habitat loss, so a loss in total area of that habitat. But then also we're altering the landscape structure, so we're creating patches of those habitats. And what Lenore Farig wanted to do is understand which of those different elements of habitat fragmentation was more important or potentially more damaging in terms of the loss of species. And what her results suggested was that the loss of habitat increased extinction possibility quite greatly, but that fragmentation itself, so that alteration of landscape structure, had only a minor influence on extinction probability of species. That was until you get to a point where less than 20% of the habitat is remaining. At that point, that altered landscape structure, that fragmentation itself, starts to have a big impact on the extinction probability of species. What these results suggest is that, for example, from a conservation standpoint, we should probably be more interested in conserving or preserving habitat generally, rather than worrying about how and to what extent habitat is fragmented. These graphs from Farig's data just show how, from her simulations, loss of habitat cover but not fragmentation affects the probability of extinction in a hypothetical species. But the bottom two graphs show that once you get down to below 20% of initial habitat coverage, that's when fragmentation does start to have a significant impact on the extinction probability of species. One thing that Farig's models might not have fully taken into consideration are factors like edge effects. So when we fragment a habitat, we increase the ratio of edge in relation to interior of that habitat. And conditions along the edge of a habitat are always different to in the interior of patches. So for example, if we take these tropical rainforests, conditions along the edges tend to be hotter, drier, with higher intensity of sunlight. You tend to get greater tree mortality, so you get a kind of reduction in the overstory. And then you get increased growth of understory plants. So the plant community is fundamentally changed along those edges. You also get decreased diversity of many animal groups, and that includes decomposers and things like carrion beetles. So it can have a significant impact on fundamental ecosystem processes. And those edge effects might stretch some way towards the interior of the patch. So it could be that patch sizes below a certain size don't actually contain any habitat that truly represents that habitat in its intact form. Of course, another big issue caused by habitat fragmentation is the potential for that fragmentation to prevent movement of animals between habitat patches. And a popular conservation tool to mitigate this has been the construction of habitat corridors. So these are strips of habitat connecting similar habitat types or patches across the landscape. Despite the use over many decades of these habitat patches, there isn't actually, or habitat corridors, there isn't actually much evidence that animals use them to significantly enhance movement between patches. And a lot of that is because in the past, the construction of these corridors hasn't really taken into consideration any knowledge of the animal behavior itself, or any kind of natural historian knowledge of the animals that we're trying to help. So an example of that comes from this moose that you can see on the right hand side, who's just going through an underpass that was built underneath the Trans-Canada Highway. So these kind of nature underpasses were initially built to allow animals to move across the Trans-Canada Highway safely. So that both increases connectivity of these habitat patches and also reduces the number of road accidents caused by animals crossing the road. But one thing that researchers found was that these underpasses were very often being kind of colonized almost by large predators like wolves that could then use these as hunting grounds to pick off deer and other large game as they traveled under the Trans-Canada Highway. So these underpasses have over time been kind of replaced by these overpasses that seem to work better in terms of actually allowing animal movement between habitat patches. So it's a good example of how just the theory of using habitat corridors has been augmented with some actual natural historian knowledge of the animals that we want to use them. So another thing to consider when we're thinking about the potential utility of habitat corridors is the role of the matrix in influencing animal movement. So essentially, some landscapes are, or habitat types or land use types, are going to provide a tougher boundary for animal movement than others. So for example, the Trans-Canada Highway is a pretty tough boundary for animal movement. So you can see the utility of landscape corridors in that case. But if we look at these two landscapes below, clearly the urban matrix on the right-hand side is going to provide a tougher barrier to animal movement than the grassland matrix that you see on the left. So this idea that the nature of the matrix will have a significant effect on the movement of animals between habitat patches was shown really nicely by an experiment by Johnson and Taylor in 2000. So they studied damselflies, and these damselflies can move happily in stream habitats and also forest habitats. And Johnson and Taylor released damselflies in stream habitats, but some of which were surrounded by a matrix of forest, some of them were surrounded by a matrix of meadow habitat, and some of them were surrounded by kind of a mixture of forest and meadow, so there was no clear matrix. What they found was in two different species of mayfly, those that were released in streams with a matrix of forest were much more likely to move away from their release sites and into the forests than were individuals that were released in streams that were surrounded by meadow habitats. So essentially those meadow habitats provided a much starker boundary for mayfly movement than the forest habitats.